A racist passenger boards a flight full of anger and entitlement. When he slaps the black flight captain during a heated argument, the entire plane is stunned. But just 7 minutes later, chaos erupts as the plane enters a deadly nosedive. As passengers scream in terror, that same captain heroically saves the flight and the man who assaulted him. What drives someone to save the life of a person who treated them with such hate? And how will the passenger cope when he's forced to confront the man who didn't just save the plane, but his life? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Mason Hargrove drummed his fingers against the armrest of the uncomfortable airport chair, checking his Rolex for the 5th time in as many minutes. The bustling Terminal 4 at LAX buzzed with activity around him, but he remained locked in his own bubble of frustration. A child's laughter pierced through the general noise, making him wince. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The flight to Chicago was already 40 minutes delayed, and his patience, never his strong suit, was wearing particularly thin today. The gate area at Terminal 22 was packed with travelers sprawled across rows of seats. Young parents tried to contain energetic toddlers, while business travelers typed frantically on laptops. Mason's tailored suit, though slightly rumpled from his rush to the airport, stood out among the casual travel wear of his fellow passengers. When the young gate agent finally approached the microphone, Mason leaned forward in his seat. Her voice crackled through the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready to begin boarding Flight 2473 to Chicago O'Hare. We'll start with our first-class passengers." Mason was on his feet before she finished speaking, shoving past a family struggling with their carry-ons. He cut straight to the front of the line, ignoring the disapproving looks from other passengers. "Sir," the gate agent said as she examined his boarding pass, her eyes falling to his carry-on bag, "I'm sorry, but your bag appears to be oversized for our overhead compartments." Mason's face flushed red. "Excuse me? I've flown with this exact bag for years. Years! Do you have any idea how many miles I've logged with your airline?" "I understand, sir, but our policy clearly states—" "Policy?" Mason barked out a laugh. "Your airline's incompetence is what needs addressing, not my bag." His voice carried through the terminal, causing several heads to turn. A middle-aged man in line behind him cleared his throat. "Hey, buddy, maybe take it easy on her. She's just doing her job." Mason spun around, his eyes blazing. "Mind your own business," he snapped. "This is between me and the airline's clearly undertrained staff." The gate agent's shoulders slumped slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. After a moment's hesitation, she waved him through. "Go ahead, sir, but please try to store it carefully." Muttering under his breath about ridiculous policies and customer service these days, Mason stormed down the jet bridge. He found his first-class seat and began arranging his belongings, pointedly ignoring the cheerful greeting from his seatmate. "Beautiful day for flying, isn't it?" the man next to him said, seemingly oblivious to Mason's dark mood. Mason responded with a grunt, pulling out his phone and pretending to check emails. The relative calm was interrupted by the appearance of the flight captain in the first-class cabin. Captain Gerald Simmons stood with perfect posture, his uniform crisp and neat. His presence commanded attention without demanding it. "Mr. Hargrove," Captain Simmons said quietly, his voice steady and professional. "I understand there was some concern about your carry-on bag at the gate. I need to personally ensure it's properly stored for everyone's safety." Mason's jaw clenched. He glared at the captain, taking in his composed demeanor and the name tag that read, Capt. G. Simmons. "Of course there's concern," Mason muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Seems like everyone on this flight wants to make my day more difficult." The first-class cabin hummed with pre-flight activity as Mason clutched his oversized carry-on bag closer to his chest, his fingers digging into the expensive leather. Captain Gerald Simmons stood in the aisle, his posture relaxed but professional, his airline captain's uniform crisp and neat against his tall frame. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but airline safety regulations require all bags to be properly stowed during takeoff and landing," Simmons explained, his voice steady and patient, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served him well through thousands of flights. Mason's face reddened, a vein pulsing at his temple. "This bag has flown with me dozens of times. I'm not about to let some power-hungry pilot tell me what to do with my personal belongings," he snapped, clutching the bag even tighter. Other first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension spreading like a ripple through the cabin. A businessman in 2B pretended to be absorbed in his phone, repeatedly scrolling past the same email, while an elderly woman across the aisle watched the scene unfold with worried eyes, her hands fidgeting with her pearl necklace. "Mr. Hargrove," Simmons continued, using the name from the passenger manifest, his tone remaining measured and professional. "We have two options here. You can either store the bag in the overhead compartment, or we can have it checked to your final destination." "Special treatment!" Mason spat, his voice rising to fill the confined space. "That's what this is about. You're singling me out." A flight attendant with a name tag reading Sarah approached, her practiced smile firmly in place, though concern flickered in her eyes. "Is there something I can help with, Captain?" Before Simmons could respond, Mason lurched to his feet, his face contorted with rage, sending his complimentary glass of water tumbling to the floor. "This is because I'm a white man, isn't it?" he shouted, jabbing a finger toward Simmons. "You people always do this." Several passengers gasped. A young woman in row 3 pulled out her phone and began recording, her hands trembling slightly. The elderly woman covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with dismay. Simmons remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged, years of military discipline evident in his bearing. "Sir, this has nothing to do with—" The sharp crack of Mason's palm against Simmons' cheek echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Time seemed to freeze as passengers stared in shocked silence, the only sound the quiet hum of the plane's ventilation system. The red mark bloomed across Simmons' dark skin, but his composure never wavered, his eyes remaining steady and clear. Without a word, Simmons turned and walked steadily back toward the cockpit, his footsteps measured and controlled. The flight attendants quickly surrounded Mason, their voices low but firm, their training kicking in to contain the situation. "Sir, please take your seat immediately," Sarah instructed, while another attendant spoke quietly into her phone, presumably calling security, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. Mason slumped back into his seat, his chest heaving with each breath. The reality of what he'd done seemed to dawn on him, but pride kept his jaw clenched and his eyes forward, fixed on the seat in front of him. Around him, passengers whispered and stared, some still recording with their phones, their judgment palpable in the recycled air. In the distance, the cockpit door clicked shut, Simmons disappearing behind it, without another word about the assault. Mason sat rigid in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests, pointedly ignoring the mix of disgust and shock on the faces around him, the weight of his actions beginning to settle heavily on his shoulders. Mason stared out the window, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the plastic cup of whiskey to his lips. The memory of his outburst earlier made his stomach churn, but he pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the amber liquid that promised temporary relief. The flight attendants had been giving him a wide berth since takeoff, their professional smiles barely masking their wariness. 30 minutes into the flight, the first tremor shook the plane. Mason's drink sloshed over the rim, spattering his expensive suit. Before he could complain, another violent shake rattled the entire aircraft. The overhead bins creaked ominously. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately," a flight attendant announced, her voice steady despite the situation. The plane lurched again, more violently this time. Screams erupted from the main cabin as the aircraft dropped suddenly, like an elevator in free fall. Mason's stomach leapt into his throat. The oxygen mask deployed with a sharp hiss, dangling and swaying with the turbulence. In the cockpit, Captain Simmons and his co-pilot worked in practiced synchronization. Their hands moved across the controls with precise, deliberate movements. Despite the chaos unfolding behind them, their voices remained measured and professional. "Heavy turbulence at 32,000 feet, Simmons reported calmly, adjusting course to avoid the worst of it. Mason had never felt so helpless. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrests, his earlier bravado completely forgotten. Each violent shake of the plane sent waves of terror through his body. The man who had been so quick to anger, so certain of his superiority, now sat pale and trembling like a child. Simmons' voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. "This is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but there's no cause for alarm. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Our aircraft is designed to handle conditions like these, and we're working to find smoother air." The plane continued to buck and shake. Passengers prayed, cried, and held hands with strangers. Mason found himself whispering apologies. To no one in particular, to everyone he'd ever wronged, to the universe itself. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, the violent motion began to subside. The plane leveled out, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Spontaneous applause broke out as passengers celebrated their skilled pilot's handling of the situation. But Mason didn't join in the clapping. A crushing pressure had begun building in his chest, radiating down his left arm. His breath came in short, painful gasps. The world started to spin, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried to call out, but could barely manage a whisper. A flight attendant passing by noticed his distress and rushed to his side. "Sir? Sir, are you all right?" Mason could only shake his head as the pain intensified. Another flight attendant joined the first, their faces showing growing concern as they assessed his condition. "Call the cockpit," one instructed the other. "We have a medical emergency in first class." Captain Gerald Simmons burst through the cockpit door, his movements swift and purposeful. The flight attendant's urgent call about a passenger in medical distress had pulled him from his duties, but his military training kicked in immediately. His heart rate barely increased as he scanned the cabin, quickly spotting Mason slumped in his first-class seat. Face ashen and unresponsive, head lolled to one side. "How long has he been unconscious?" Simmons asked, kneeling beside Mason's seat. His fingers pressed against Mason's neck, searching for a pulse, while his other hand checked for breathing. Years of medical training guided every precise movement. "Just a minute or two," the flight attendant replied, her voice steady despite the tension. He grabbed his chest and collapsed. He was complaining about indigestion earlier. Simmons' trained eyes took in Mason's symptoms, the bluish tinge to his lips, the cold sweat beading on his forehead, the shallow, irregular breathing. "Possible heart attack. Get me the emergency medical kit and the defibrillator, now, and notify ground control we may need priority landing clearance." The cabin had gone completely silent, the usual ambient noise of conversation and movement frozen in the gravity of the moment. Passengers watched, wide-eyed and holding their breath, as Simmons unbuttoned Mason's collar and began chest compressions. The same hands that had been struck earlier now worked tirelessly to keep Mason's heart pumping, each compression measured and deliberate. "Come on," Simmons muttered, maintaining a steady rhythm. Sweat began to form on his forehead as he counted under his breath. The flight attendant returned with the defibrillator, and Simmons worked quickly to attach the pads to Mason's chest, his movements practiced and efficient. "Clear!" he commanded, and everyone pulled back, some passengers instinctively gripping their armrests. Mason's body jerked as the electrical current passed through him. Simmons checked for a pulse, his expression focused and determined, then resumed compressions with unwavering precision. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, Mason's chest rose with a shallow breath. His pulse returned, weak but steady beneath Simmons' fingertips. Simmons monitored him closely until color began returning to his face, the ghostly pallor slowly giving way to a healthier pink. "He's stabilizing," Simmons announced, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. He stayed by Mason's side until he was certain the immediate danger had passed, checking vital signs every few minutes, then rose to his feet with the quiet dignity of someone who had done nothing more remarkable than his duty. As Simmons turned to head back to the cockpit, Mason's eyes fluttered open. He looked confused, disoriented, his gaze wandering across the cabin ceiling. The passenger next to him, an elderly woman with kind eyes, leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "That captain just saved your life," she said, nodding toward Simmons' retreating form. Her words carried both awe and gentle reproach. Mason stared ahead, his mouth slightly open, as the weight of those words settled over him like a heavy blanket. His hand trembled as it moved to his chest, feeling the lingering soreness from the compressions. He watched Simmons disappear into the cockpit, unable to form words or even thoughts, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, bringing with it an overwhelming wave of confusion and shame. The plane touched down at Denver International Airport with a gentle thud, emergency vehicles already lined up along the tarmac. Inside the first-class cabin, Mason Hargrove remained slumped in his seat, drifting in and out of consciousness. His expensive suit was wrinkled and damp with sweat, his usually commanding presence diminished to that of a fragile patient. "Sir, the EMTs are boarding now," a flight attendant said softly, touching Mason's shoulder. He managed a weak nod, his head feeling too heavy to lift properly. Captain Simmons emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp despite the crisis. He stood near the front of the cabin, watching as 3 EMTs made their way down the aisle with their equipment and a stretcher. "Possible cardiac event," Simmons reported to the lead EMT, his voice steady and professional. "Patient lost consciousness approximately 40 minutes ago. We performed CPR and used the AED once to restore normal rhythm." The EMTs worked efficiently, attaching monitors to Mason's chest and checking his vital signs. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" one asked, shining a light in Mason's eyes. "Mason Hargrove," he mumbled, his words slurring slightly. As the EMTs carefully transferred him to the stretcher, passengers began whispering among themselves. "Did you see how the captain handled everything?" a woman said in awe. "First the turbulence, then saving that man's life." "Real hero, that pilot," another passenger agreed, "especially after how that guy treated him before takeoff." Mason's cheeks burned with shame as he caught fragments of their conversations. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling, unable to bear the sympathetic and some knowing looks from his fellow passengers. The same people who had witnessed his earlier outburst were now watching him being wheeled out like an invalid. "Clear the aisle, please," an EMT called as they carefully maneuvered the stretcher toward the exit. Mason caught a glimpse of Simmons standing near the door, his expression neutral but watchful. The man he had slapped just hours ago had ended up saving his life. The irony wasn't lost on Mason, and it made his stomach churn with a mixture of humiliation and resentment. In the ambulance, Mason lay still as the EMTs continued their assessment. The sirens wailed overhead, but all he could hear was the echo of those passengers' voices praising Simmons. His jaw clenched as he thought about how quickly he had lost control of the situation. First the bag incident, then his shameful outburst, and now this. He was Mason Hargrove, a respected former attorney who had never let anyone get the better of him. This couldn't be how people would remember him. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Mason's mind raced despite his physical weakness. He wouldn't let this incident define him. He couldn't. Sunlight filtered through Mason's expensive curtains, casting long shadows across his king-sized bed. His chest ached, a constant reminder of yesterday's humiliation. The house felt emptier than usual, its pristine surfaces and carefully curated artwork offering no comfort. Reaching for the remote with trembling hands, Mason clicked on the massive flat-screen TV mounted on his bedroom wall. His heart sank as his own face filled the screen. A still image from a passenger's phone showing him mid-argument with Captain Simmons. The incident occurred shortly before takeoff, the news anchor reported, her voice crisp and professional. Witnesses say Mr. Hargrove, a retired attorney, became aggressive over luggage restrictions and physically assaulted the flight captain. Mason's face burned as amateur footage played, showing his confrontation from multiple angles. The slap echoed through his bedroom speakers, making him wince. Captain Gerald Simmons showed remarkable restraint, a passenger testified on screen. He remained professional even after being attacked. And then to save the man's life later? That's real character. Grabbing his phone from the nightstand, Mason saw dozens of missed calls and messages. As he watched, another call came in, Richard Stewart, his former law partner. Mason rejected it, only to see 3 text messages pop up from other colleagues. "What were you thinking, Mason?" "Saw you on the news." Disappointed, doesn't begin to cover it. "You've really done it this time." In his spacious living room, Mason paced back and forth across the Persian rug, his bare feet sinking into the expensive wool. His phone kept buzzing, journalists, old clients, even his country club acquaintances. Each notification made his jaw clench tighter. "They're blowing this completely out of proportion," he muttered, running his hands through his silver hair. One moment of frustration, and suddenly, I'm public enemy number 1? That captain was on a power trip. Anyone could see that. The familiar anger rose in his chest as he convinced himself he'd been wronged. The media was twisting everything, making him look like some unhinged elitist while portraying Simmons as a saint. Moving to his study, Mason settled into his leather chair. The room's dark wood paneling and law degrees on the wall usually made him feel powerful, in control. He opened his laptop, squinting at the screen's brightness, and began composing an email to James Fisher, his personal attorney. "James, the media is slandering me over yesterday's incident. Need to discuss legal options immediately. These accusations are damaging my reputation. Time to fight back." His fingers stabbed at the keys as he typed, muttering under his breath. "They want to make me the villain? Fine, but I won't go down without a fight. They have no idea who they're dealing with." Mason sat in his leather chair, drumming his fingers on the polished mahogany desk. His laptop screen glowed with dozens of open tabs about Gerald Simmons, but he needed more. With shaking hands, he dialed the number of Drake Investigations. "Mr. Harrison, Mason Hargrove here. I need everything you can find on a Gerald Simmons. He's an airline captain with United." Mason's voice carried an edge of desperation. "I want his whole history. There's something off about him. The way he handled that turbulence. It wasn't natural." "Sir, that's quite an undertaking," the investigator replied. What exactly are you looking for? Everything. School records, military service, family history. He's hiding something. I know it. Mason grabbed a pen, gripping it so tight his knuckles turned white. Money is no object. The scene shifted to the investigator's cluttered office, where stacks of papers and multiple computer monitors displayed fragments of Gerald Simmons' life. The investigator held his phone between ear and shoulder as he scrolled through records. "Mr. Hargrove, I found something significant," he said carefully. "Simmons' father was murdered 30 years ago. Hate crime. The perpetrators were defended by—" He paused. "Well, by your old firm." Mason's breath caught. "Go on." "Simmons served as an Air Force medic for 12 years. Distinguished record. Multiple commendations for—" Mason's sleek BMW crept down the peaceful suburban street, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His rehearsed accusations echoed in his mind as he scanned house numbers, searching for Simmons' address. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across manicured lawns and blooming flower beds. When he finally spotted the modest two-story home, the scene before him made his stomach twist. Gerald Simmons stood in his front yard, baseball glove in hand, laughing as he played catch with a young boy. The child's face glowed with joy as he caught another throw from his father, his gap-toothed smile visible even from the street. "Nice catch, Tommy," Simmons called out, his voice warm with pride. "Your arm's getting stronger every day." Mason pulled up to the curb, his jealousy burning hot in his chest. The peaceful domesticity of the moment felt like a personal affront. Here was Simmons, living a picture-perfect life while Mason's reputation lay in tatters. Simmons noticed the car immediately. His expression shifted slightly, not afraid or angry, just alert and watchful. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Head inside now, Tommy," he said quietly. "Do your homework. I'll be there in a few minutes." The boy glanced curiously at Mason's car before nodding and jogging toward the house. Simmons waited until the front door closed behind his son before walking toward the driveway. His steps were measured, unhurried. Mason burst from his car, trembling with barely contained rage. "You planned it all, didn't you?" he spat. "The turbulence, my collapse. It was all revenge for that stupid SLAP." Simmons stood perfectly still, hands relaxed at his sides. He listened without interruption as Mason's accusations grew wilder and more desperate. When Mason finally ran out of breath, Simmons spoke softly but clearly. "I remember you, Mr. Hargrove," he said. "Not from the flight, from the Matthews trial 15 years ago. You defended the men who burned crosses in people's yards, who spread hate through our community." His voice remained steady. 3 months after you won that case, some of those same men murdered my father." Mason's mouth went dry, his prepared speech crumbling to dust. "You gave them the freedom to continue their campaign of terror," Simmons continued. "You knew what they were, what they did, but you defended them anyway, made excuses for their hatred." The dying sunlight cast long shadows across Simmons' face as he delivered his final words. "You've spent your life defending the indefensible, but I chose not to let your actions define mine." Without another word, Simmons turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Mason standing alone in the growing darkness, the weight of his past pressing down on him like a physical force. Mason's hands trembled violently on the steering wheel as he drove away from Simmons' house, his knuckles white from his death grip. The setting sun cast long, menacing shadows across his windshield, but even darker shadows lurked in his mind, threatening to overwhelm him. Images from that infamous trial flooded back, memories he'd carefully locked away for years, now breaking free like water through a crumbling dam. "Your Honor, my clients were merely exercising their right to free speech." His own voice echoed in his head. the words now tasting like poison in his mouth. He remembered the victims' families in the courtroom, their faces twisted in anguish as he argued for the hate group's protection. The mother's quiet sobs still rang in his ears. He dismissed their tears as theatrical then, focused only on winning the case and padding his reputation. The traffic light turned red, and Mason slammed on his brakes, the car lurching forward. His chest felt tight as more memories surfaced, each one a fresh wound. The hate group's leader had smiled and shaken his hand after the verdict, his grip firm and congratulatory. "You really showed them, counselor," he'd said, grinning ear to ear. Mason had accepted the praise then, even preened under it like a peacock, blind to the consequences of his actions. Back at his house, Mason's footsteps echoed through the empty halls like accusations. He made his way to his study, fumbling with a crystal decanter of whiskey, nearly dropping it twice. The amber liquid splashed over the rim of his glass as his hands shook uncontrollably, leaving dark spots on his sleeve. "Just doing my job," he muttered bitterly, taking a long, burning drink. "Every defendant deserves representation." The words felt hollow now, excuses worn paper-thin by time and consequence. He clicked play on the flight video again, watching himself collapse in his seat while Simmons rushed to save him, the man's face filled with genuine concern. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man whose life he'd helped destroy had saved his without hesitation. His face burned with shame as he poured another drink, spilling more on the desk. The video played on repeat, each viewing stoking his anger and confusion until both threatened to consume him. Hours passed in a blur, the whiskey bottle growing emptier as Mason's thoughts grew darker and more twisted. Finally, rage and self-loathing boiled over like a pot left too long on the stove. With a primal roar, he hurled his glass at the television. The screen exploded in a violent shower of sparks and glass, plunging the room into darkness and filling the air with the smell of burnt electronics. In the sudden silence, Mason slumped into his leather chair, deflated and spent. The only sound was his ragged breathing and the occasional tinkle of settling glass hitting the hardwood floor. His carefully constructed justifications lay shattered like the TV screen, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of his choices and the man he'd become. Mason jerked awake in his king-sized bed, his silk pajamas soaked with sweat and twisted around his trembling body. His heart hammered against his ribs as the nightmare's images lingered, each terrifying detail crystal clear in his mind. In the dream, he'd been back on that plane, but everything was worse, more vivid and threatening. The aircraft had plummeted through dark clouds while passengers screamed, their voices a deafening chorus of terror. Simmons stood in the aisle, watching him with cold, unblinking eyes as Mason clutched his chest in agony, the pain feeling more real than any dream should. "Help me," he'd begged in the dream, his voice weak and desperate, but Simmons just smiled, a cruel twist of lips that spoke volumes. The plane had suddenly leveled out, and the passengers burst into applause, praising their heroic captain with enthusiastic cheers and grateful tears. Meanwhile, Mason lay dying in his seat, completely invisible to everyone around him, as if he'd become a ghost in his own nightmare. Their cheers had turned into cruel, mocking laughter as darkness closed in around him like a suffocating shroud. Mason stumbled to his bathroom, his legs unsteady beneath him, splashing handful after handful of cold water on his face. His reflection looked haunted, dark circles under his bloodshot eyes, skin pale and clammy, like a man who'd seen his own ghost. He hadn't slept properly since the flight, spending his nights tossing and turning in a constant state of dread. Later that morning, Mason sat in Dr. Patel's office, his leg bouncing nervously as he described his symptoms, his manicured fingernails digging into the armrests. The small examination room felt suffocating, the walls seeming to inch closer with each passing minute. "I can't sleep. When I do, I have these nightmares," Mason explained, his voice tight and strained. "And during the day, my chest gets tight. I feel like I can't breathe, like I'm back on that plane." Dr. Patel nodded sympathetically, making notes in his patient file with careful, measured strokes. "These sound like classic anxiety symptoms, Mason. Given the recent stress you've experienced—" "Stress?" Mason interrupted, his voice rising to a sharp edge. "You mean the media witch hunt? The constant harassment? I suppose you've seen the news too? Read all about the big bad lawyer?" "Mason, I'm simply trying to—" "No, I see how you're looking at me," Mason snapped, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "You've already decided I'm the villain, just like everyone else. I bet you're friends with Simmons too, aren't you? Part of his little conspiracy?" Dr. Patel's expression remained professional but concerned, his pen poised above the prescription pad. "I can prescribe something to help with the anxiety." "Save it," Mason snarled, grabbing his coat and yanking it off the hook. "I don't need your biased opinion or your pity." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the frames on the wall. Back in his study, Mason spread the investigator's reports across his mahogany desk, the papers forming a maze of connections in his mind. His fingers traced the newspaper clipping about Simmons' father's murder, the yellowed paper crackling beneath his touch. The hate group he'd defended had later been linked to the crime, though nothing was ever proven in court. "This is why he did it," Mason muttered, circling phrases in red pen with increasing intensity. "He blamed me all along. The turbulence, the heart attack. It was all planned, all orchestrated." He connected dates and events with frenzied lines, building a conspiracy in his mind that felt more real with each passing moment, each new connection reinforcing his paranoid theory. The rational part of his brain tried to protest, whispering doubts about his conclusions. But Mason pushed those thoughts aside with desperate determination. It was easier to believe in Simmons's vendetta than to face his own role in enabling hatred and violence. Easier to see himself as the victim than confront the damage he'd done. Mason's phone buzzed again, lighting up with his lawyer's name. He'd been avoiding calls all morning, but this one he had to take. With a heavy sigh, he answered, his fingers trembling slightly against the smooth screen. "Mason, we need to get ahead of this," Richard Barnes said, skipping pleasantries. "The footage is everywhere. Social media is having a field day. Twitter's exploding, and the major networks have picked it up." "Let them," Mason growled, pacing his kitchen. His expensive loafers clicked against the marble floor with each agitated step. "I'm not apologizing for anything." "Listen to reason," Richard pressed. "A public apology could save what's left of your reputation. We can frame it as a stress-induced moment. Mention your health scare. Maybe even suggest the medication played a role." "Absolutely not." Mason slammed his hand on the counter, making his coffee mug rattle. "I won't grovel to appease the cancel culture mob. They're all acting like I'm some kind of monster while treating that pilot like he's Jesus Christ himself. The man was being deliberately difficult." Mason flopped onto his leather couch, flipping on the TV. His stomach churned as he recognized the news anchor discussing his case, her professional demeanor barely masking her obvious disapproval. In a remarkable display of professionalism, Captain Gerald Simmons not only safely guided the aircraft through severe turbulence, but also administered life-saving medical care to an unruly passenger, the same man who had struck him earlier during boarding. Witnesses say the captain's quick thinking likely prevented a tragic outcome. The segment cut to cell phone footage of Mason's SLAP, followed by interviews with passengers. The shaky video made Mason wince, seeing himself in such an unflattering light. The captain was so calm. Even after that horrible man hit him, a woman recounted, clutching her purse nervously. And then to turn around and save his life? That's true character. We need more people like him in the world. Mason's hand shook as he grabbed the remote, turning up the volume. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. This incident has sparked important conversations about privilege and entitlement in our society, the anchor continued. Captain Simmons' response serves as an inspiring example of grace under pressure, showing how professionalism and compassion can triumph over hostility. By evening, Mason sat in his study, an empty whiskey bottle on his desk and another half-empty one within reach. His computer screen glowed in the darkness as he furiously typed an email to the news station's editorial board, his fingers missing keys and requiring frequent backspacing. "Your biased reporting constitutes defamation," he wrote, words slightly blurred through his drunken haze. "Unless you issue an immediate retraction, I will pursue legal action for damages to my reputation and career. Your one-sided portrayal of events is unconscionable." His finger hovered over the send button before jabbing it decisively. Mason refreshed his inbox repeatedly, waiting for a response that wouldn't come. The silence of his empty house pressed in around him as he stared at the screen, his anger barely masking his growing sense of isolation. Outside his window, the setting sun cast long shadows across his manicured lawn, much like the shadows now creeping across his once sterling reputation. The doorbell's chime cut through Mason's self-pitying thoughts. He muted the TV, irritated at the interruption. Through the frosted glass of his front door, he could make out a familiar silhouette that made his stomach twist. Emily stood on his doorstep, her arms crossed. She wore her business attire, a navy blazer and pencil skirt that reminded him of her mother. Her dark eyes, usually warm, were cold with disappointment. "Hello, Dad," she said flatly as he opened the door. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Emily, this is unexpected," Mason managed, closing the door behind her. "Is it?" She turned to face him. "Did you think I wouldn't see the video? That I wouldn't hear about how my father slapped a pilot and then collapsed from a heart attack?" Mason's face flushed. "The media is blowing everything out of proportion." "Stop!" Emily's voice cracked. "Just stop with the excuses. Do you know what it was like sitting in a meeting yesterday when someone pulled up that video? Everyone looking at me because they know you're my father?" She moved into the living room, shaking her head at the empty whiskey glass on the coffee table. "This is exactly why I stopped bringing friends home in high school. Remember Lisa? My best friend till you made those comments about her family? That was different." "It wasn't different," Emily's voice rose. "Lisa's parents were immigrants who worked harder than anyone I knew. But you couldn't see past your prejudices. Just like you couldn't see past whatever triggered you on that flight." Mason sank into his armchair, defensive anger rising. "You don't understand. That pilot saved your life." Emily's eyes glistened. "After you slapped him, he still saved your life. And instead of being grateful, you're sitting here drinking and feeling sorry for yourself." She walked toward the foyer, stopping at the door. "You know what's sad, Dad? You're going to die bitter and alone if you don't change. And it won't be because the world is against you. It'll be because you pushed everyone away with your hatred." The door closed behind her with a quiet click that somehow hurt more than if she'd slammed it. Mason stared at the space where she'd stood, then reached for the whiskey bottle with trembling hands. Empty bottles littered Mason's kitchen counter, a far cry from its usual spotless state. The morning sun filtered through unwashed windows, casting shadows on the mess that had accumulated over the past week. Mason slouched in his leather armchair, his once crisp suit wrinkled and stained. His phone buzzed again, probably his lawyer's 15th attempt to reach him today. Mason grabbed it and hurled it across the room, watching it bounce off the wall with dull satisfaction. That night, his BMW crept slowly down Simmons' peaceful suburban street. Mason parked 3 houses away, engine off, watching. Through the living room window, he could see Simmons on the couch, his son curled up next to him as they watched TV together. Simmons' wife brought them cookies, and their genuine laughter carried faintly through the night air. Mason's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The scene before him was like a knife twisting in his gut. Everything he'd lost with Emily, everything he'd thrown away. For a moment, rage surged through him. He reached for his door handle, ready to storm up to their house. But the sight of Simmons hugging his son stopped him cold. Shame washed over him in a sickening wave. He started his car and drove home in a daze, barely registering the trip. The first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon when he stumbled into his bathroom. The harsh fluorescent lights revealed every line and shadow on his haggard face. His bloodshot eyes stared back at him from the mirror, and he barely recognized the man he'd become. "You pathetic!" he snarled at his reflection. His fist flew before he could think, connecting with the mirror in an explosion of glass and pain. Blood dripped from his knuckles into the sink, bright red against the white porcelain. Mason stood frozen, watching his blood swirl down the drain. For the first time in days, his mind felt crystal clear. The sight of his own blood, the physical pain, it cut through the fog of alcohol and self-pity. He had to face what he'd done, not just on the plane, but throughout his entire career. The weight of years of defending the indefensible pressed down on him like a physical force. Mason's hand shook as he held his phone to his ear, listening to the private investigator's gravelly voice. Sunlight streamed through his study window, illuminating dancing dust particles, but Mason barely noticed. His attention was fixed on each devastating detail the investigator shared. "Mr. Hargrove, the connection is clear," the investigator said. "The hate group you defended. They had been terrorizing the Simmons family for months before the murder. Threatening letters, vandalism, intimidation tactics." Mason's throat went dry. He reached for his glass of water but knocked it over, spilling across his mahogany desk. He didn't move to clean it up. "There's more," the investigator continued. 3 weeks before Mr. Simmons' murder, the group staged a demonstration outside their church. Your legal defense of their right to protest was cited in the police report when they refused to intervene. Mason ended the call without responding. His legs felt weak as he pulled out the old trial files from his cabinet. The familiar yellow legal pads contained his handwritten notes, carefully crafted arguments defending the group's constitutional rights and freedom of expression. He remembered standing in court, confidently spinning their actions as protected speech. He'd called their intimidation tactics peaceful demonstrations and their threats political discourse. His clever wordplay had won the case, earning him accolades and a hefty fee. Now, those same words made his stomach turn. Each page revealed another layer of calculated manipulation. Another way he'd helped shield violent bigots from consequences. The group had taken his legal victory as permission to escalate their harassment, leading directly to the murder of Simmons' father. The afternoon light faded as Mason sat motionless in his study, processing the weight of his role in the tragedy. His usual defensive instincts tried to surface, arguments about doing his job, about the legal system's neutrality, but they felt hollow now. In the dimly lit living room, Mason clutched the investigator's report. His hands trembled as he read through the detailed timeline again. The same man whose life he'd helped destroy had saved him on that plane without hesitation. "He saved me," Mason whispered into the empty room, his voice cracking. "Despite everything I've done, he saved me." The words hung in the air, heavy with the first genuine remorse Mason had felt in years. His carefully constructed justifications began crumbling, leaving him face to face with the real impact of his choices. Mason sat at his desk, the lamp casting a warm glow across scattered papers. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up his pen, trying to find words that felt genuine after a lifetime of crafting manipulative arguments. "Dear Captain Simmons," he wrote, then immediately crossed it out. Too formal. "Mr. Simmons," he tried again, but that felt wrong too. He crumpled the paper and tossed it aside. "Gerald," he began a third time, "I want to explain my actions." He stopped, grimacing. More excuses. Another paper joined the growing pile on the floor. Hours passed as Mason struggled with draft after draft. Some began with lengthy explanations of his stress levels that day on the plane. Others tried to minimize his role in defending the hate group. Each attempt revealed another layer of his ingrained defensiveness. "I was just doing my job," he wrote in one version, then laughed bitterly at himself. The same excuse he'd used for decades to justify representing clients he knew were causing harm. Finally, around midnight, surrounded by dozens of crumpled attempts, Mason took a deep breath and began writing from his heart. "Gerald, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but you deserve my truth. I acted shamefully on that flight, treating you with contempt and violence. When you saved my life despite my behavior, you showed me what real character looks like. But my debt to you goes deeper than that day. Years ago, I helped defend the people who terrorized your family. I convinced myself it was just legal work, that I wasn't responsible for what they did. I was wrong. My actions enabled their hatred and contributed to your father's death. You had every reason to let me die on that plane. Instead, you chose to be better than me. Your mercy haunts me, because I know I haven't earned it. I am truly sorry for all the pain I've caused. Mason Hargrove." He read it over several times, resisting the urge to add qualifiers or justifications. For once he let the raw truth stand. With shaking hands, he folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. He wrote Simmons' address carefully on the front, then set it on his desk. The envelope seemed to stare back at him, challenging him to follow through. Mason's hand hovered over it, his pride warring with his conscience. The letter represented everything he'd spent his life avoiding: vulnerability, accountability, shame. He drew back, leaving it untouched on the desk's polished surface. Mason pushed his shopping cart down the cereal aisle, his footsteps echoing in the quiet store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he reached for a box of plain oatmeal. He'd been trying to eat healthier since the plane incident, though his doctor's warnings still rang in his ears. A sharp pain suddenly gripped his chest, different from his previous heart attack, but terrifying nonetheless. The oatmeal box slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Mason grabbed the shelf for support, his knuckles turning white as the pain intensified. "Sir? Are you okay?" A young woman in yoga clothes stopped her cart, concern etched on her face. Mason tried to wave her off, but his legs buckled. He slumped to the floor, breathing heavily. The woman immediately knelt beside him. "Someone call 911, she shouted, her voice carrying through the store. Other shoppers gathered around, and Mason heard someone speaking urgently into a phone. A middle-aged man in a store uniform appeared with a folding chair, though Mason couldn't make it up from the floor. "Stay with us, sir," the man said, keeping his voice calm. "Help is on the way." The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient movements familiar to Mason after his previous emergency. As they checked his vitals and attached monitoring equipment, he found himself surrounded by strangers who showed genuine concern for his well-being. "BP is elevated," one EMT announced, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around Mason's arm. "Sir, can you tell me if you have any history of heart problems?" Mason nodded weakly. "Heart attack. On a plane. Few months ago." The young woman who'd first stopped to help was still there, holding Mason's hand. He'd spent so many years pushing people away, yet here were complete strangers showing him kindness he didn't deserve. Later that evening, Mason lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles. The doctor had confirmed it wasn't another heart attack, just severe anxiety, but the experience had shaken him deeply. He thought about Captain Simmons, about the passengers who'd witnessed his collapse on the plane, and now these strangers in the grocery store. He'd been saved 3 times now by people who owed him nothing. The letter to Simmons sat in his desk drawer at home, waiting to be sent. Mason closed his eyes, remembering the gentle touch of the woman who'd held his hand, the store employee's calm voice, the EMT's professional care. "It's time," he whispered to himself, knowing he needed to mail that letter as soon as he got home. Gerald Simmons sat in his favorite worn leather armchair, warm afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room windows as he carefully opened the unexpected letter with steady hands. His wife Sarah paused her gardening magazine, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she watched his expression change while he read. "It's from Mason Hargrove," Gerald said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of recognition. "The man from the flight." Sarah set down her magazine with deliberate care. "The one who—" She didn't finish the sentence, but concern filled her eyes. "Yes." Gerald's eyes moved methodically across the pages, taking in each carefully written word, noting the slight tremor in the handwriting. The letter was longer than he'd expected, spanning several pages filled with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "What does he say?" Sarah asked, moving to perch on the arm of his chair, her hand finding its familiar place on his shoulder. Gerald took a deep breath, his fingers tightening slightly on the paper's edge. "He's apologizing, not just for the flight incident, but for his role in defending the group that—" He paused, memories of his father's murder briefly clouding his thoughts like storm clouds across a summer sky. "He says he's been forced to confront his past actions and their consequences. Says he's been doing a lot of soul-searching." Sarah squeezed his shoulder gently, her wedding ring catching the sunlight. "How do you feel about it?" Gerald folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate and measured. "I need to respond, but I'm not sure how. This isn't something I ever expected to deal with." "You don't owe him forgiveness," Sarah reminded him softly, her voice filled with protective concern. "No," Gerald agreed, standing to walk to his oak desk in the corner. "But I can acknowledge his effort to change." He pulled out a sheet of cream-colored paper and began writing, choosing his words, with the same care he'd always shown in difficult situations. The response was brief but clear. He appreciated Mason's honesty and courage in writing the letter, but true redemption would require more than words. It would take sustained effort and genuine change, actions that spoke louder than any written apology. The next morning, Gerald walked to their mailbox under a brightening sky, response letter in hand. As he raised the red flag, he felt a sense of completion settle over him. Not forgiveness, that wasn't his to give yet, but acceptance that everyone's journey toward being better was their own to walk, even those who had caused deep pain. Mason's hands trembled as he retrieved the envelope from his mailbox. The return address confirmed it was from Gerald Simmons. He hurried inside, nearly dropping his keys in his rush to open it. Settling into his study chair, Mason unfolded the crisp paper. Simmons' handwriting was neat and deliberate. "Mr. Hargrove, I've received and read your letter. While I appreciate your apology and acknowledgement of past actions, words alone cannot undo the harm caused. True redemption requires sustained effort and meaningful change. I neither condemn nor absolve you. That journey is yours to undertake." Mason read the letter 3 times, his throat tightening. There was no anger in Simmons' words, just clear-eyed truth. The next morning, Mason drove to the East Side Community Center. The brick building looked weathered, but well-maintained. Inside, he met Sandra Chen, the volunteer coordinator, a woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes and a direct manner. "Why do you want to volunteer here?" she asked, studying him carefully. Mason shifted in his chair. I want to do something meaningful, to help." Sandra nodded slowly. "We always need help in the food pantry. Sorting donations, stocking shelves. It's not glamorous work." "I understand," Mason said quietly. "I'm willing to do whatever's needed." For the next few hours, Mason sorted canned goods alongside other volunteers. His back ached from bending and lifting, and his designer clothes were dusty. But watching families receive their food boxes with genuine gratitude touched something long dormant in his heart. That evening, Mason sat at his desk, opening a new journal. His hand moved across the page. First day at the community center. The work was physical, mundane, but seeing people's faces when they received help, it meant something. Sandra didn't treat me like the man from the viral video. She just expected me to do the work, no special treatment. It was harder than I expected, facing myself without the shield of status or money. But maybe that's the point. Tomorrow I go back. He closed the journal, feeling drained but somehow lighter. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of purpose. Mason's hand shook as he opened Emily's letter, his heart racing at the sight of her familiar handwriting. The morning sunlight streamed through his study window as he read, "Dad, I've been thinking about your calls and messages. While I'm not ready to forgive you, I am willing to listen. Let's meet for coffee at the Daily Grind tomorrow at 2 p.m. To be clear, this isn't absolution. It's a chance to talk. That's all I can offer right now." The next afternoon, Mason arrived at the cafe 20 minutes early, fidgeting with his collar in the reflection of the storefront window. When Emily walked in, her posture was stiff, her expression guarded. She wore the silver necklace he'd given her for her college graduation, though he wasn't sure if that meant anything. "Hi, Dad," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Emily, thank you for..." She held up her hand. "Before we start, I need to set some ground rules. I'm here to listen, not to make promises. And if you try to justify what happened on that plane, or deflect blame, I'm leaving." Mason nodded, his throat tight. "I understand." The barista brought their drinks, her usual vanilla latte, his black coffee. Emily wrapped her hands around the warm mug, but didn't drink. "I've been volunteering at the community center," Mason said quietly. "It's humbling. I'm learning a lot about the people I used to dismiss." Emily's eyebrows rose slightly. "The community center. You. 3 times a week now. Started in the kitchen serving meals. The coordinator didn't trust me with much else at first." He managed a self-deprecating smile. "Can't say I blame her." "And this isn't just for show? To repair your image?" "No." Mason met her eyes. "I'm doing it because I need to change. Really change. The incident with Captain Simmons, it forced me to see myself clearly for the first time in years. I didn't like what I saw." Emily studied him for a long moment. "You know this won't be fixed overnight." "I know." They finished their coffee in silence. Outside the cafe, Emily paused before heading to her car. "I'll be watching what you do next," she said firmly. Mason nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Thank you for giving me this chance." He watched her drive away, the afternoon sun warm on his face. For the first time in years, he felt a tiny spark of hope for their relationship. The daily grind buzzed with quiet afternoon chatter as Mason sat at a corner table, obsessively straightening his silverware. His crisp blue shirt felt too tight at the collar, and he found himself checking his watch every few minutes. The coffee in front of him had gone cold, untouched. When Emily walked in, Mason's breath caught. She moved with the same confident stride she'd had since high school, but her eyes held a wariness that made his heart ache. She wore a simple black blazer and carried herself with the poise of someone who had grown strong, despite, not because of, her upbringing. "Why now?" Emily asked as soon as she sat down, not bothering with pleasantries. "After all these years of silence, why reach out?" Mason opened his mouth to respond, and his first instinct was to cite the media attention, his health scare, anything to justify himself. But he caught the defensive tone rising in his throat and stopped. Taking a deep breath, he looked directly at his daughter. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. "I've been wrong for so long, I forgot what right looked like." Emily's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained silent, waiting. "I drove you away," Mason continued, his voice growing hoarse. "My prejudice, my hatred. I couldn't see past my own narrow view of the world. When you brought Sarah home in high school—" "My best friend," Emily interrupted sharply, "who you called inappropriate company." "Yes," Mason acknowledged, the shame burning in his chest. "And when you dated Michael in college, you said he wasn't our kind of people." Emily's voice was steady, but held years of pain. "Do you know what it's like to have a father who judges everyone by the color of their skin? Who taught me to be ashamed of my friends?" Mason felt the familiar urge to defend himself, to explain away his actions. Instead, he forced himself to meet her gaze. "No," he said quietly. "I don't know what that's like, but I know what I did to you was unforgivable. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I need you to know I see it now. All of it. How much I hurt you." They sat in heavy silence as Emily studied his face. Finally, she stood, gathering her purse. "This doesn't mean everything is fixed," she said firmly, "but it's a start." Mason nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you for coming." He watched her walk away, the evening sun casting long shadows through the cafe windows. For the first time in years, he understood that words meant nothing without actions to back them up. Gerald Simmons sat in his home office, the warm glow of his desk lamp casting shadows across Mason's letter. His fingers traced the creases in the paper, feeling the weight of every carefully chosen word. The apology was thorough, even raw in its honesty, but it stirred memories Simmons had worked hard to process over the years. His wife Sarah appeared in the doorway, her presence as gentle as always. "Still thinking about his letter?" she asked, moving to stand behind his chair. "Yeah," Simmons nodded, leaning back. "He's trying to make amends, real ones it seems." "And how do you feel about that?" Sarah's hand rested on his shoulder, steady and grounding. Simmons sighed deeply. "It brings back memories of Dad. The trial. How Mason twisted everything to protect those men." He shook his head slowly. "But there's something different in his words now. Something broken open." Moving to the living room, Simmons settled into his favorite armchair. The house was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock, a sound that always reminded him of evenings with his father, working on homework while Dad read the newspaper. The memories of the trial flooded back. Mason's confident stride in the courtroom, his calculated arguments that painted the hate group as misunderstood patriots, the way he diminished the impact of their actions, making light of the terror they'd spread through the community. And then, just months later, his father's murder. But now, sitting in the peaceful darkness of his living room, Simmons felt the familiar anger mingled with something else, a recognition of the courage it must have taken for Mason to face his own role in perpetuating that hatred. Later that night, Simmons returned to his office and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Instead of addressing Mason, he began writing to himself, "Dear Gerald, the hardest part of healing isn't forgiving others. It's learning to live with the scars while refusing to let them define you. Dad taught us that strength isn't about winning fights, but about choosing which battles matter." His pen moved steadily across the paper as he explored his own journey, acknowledging that Mason's redemption would have to be his own. Simmons had already chosen his path, one of integrity and grace, and that was enough. Mason stood backstage at the community center, wiping his sweaty palms on his pressed slacks. The familiar smell of coffee and cookies wafted through the air as volunteers set up refreshments for the shelter's fundraiser. Through the curtain, he could hear the low murmur of conversation as people filled the folding chairs. Sarah Chen, the shelter coordinator, approached him with a reassuring smile. "Ready, Mr. Hargrove?" He managed a tight nod. After 6 months of volunteering, serving meals, and helping with paperwork, this moment felt more daunting than any courtroom appearance. Sarah stepped up to the podium, her voice warm but professional. "Tonight, we have someone special to share his story. Many of you know Mason Hargrove from his volunteer work here at the shelter. His journey reminds us that change is possible when we face our mistakes with courage and commitment to doing better." Mason's legs felt like lead as he approached the podium. The lights seemed too bright, and he could feel dozens of eyes watching him. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism. He unfolded his prepared notes with shaking hands. "6 months ago," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "I was a different person. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. I was the same person I'd always been, entitled, prejudiced, and completely blind to the harm I caused." He paused, taking a deep breath. "It took a public meltdown on an airplane and the extraordinary kindness of someone I'd wronged to wake me up." Mason described the flight incident, not sparing himself any embarrassment. He watched as people shifted in their seats, some nodding in recognition of the viral story. "But that wasn't the worst of it," he continued. "For years, I used my legal expertise to defend hate groups, telling myself it was just business. I pushed away my daughter because I couldn't accept her diverse friend group. I lived in a bubble of privilege and bias, hurting countless people along the way." As he spoke about his ongoing journey to change, he noticed tears in some audience members' eyes. Others sat with arms crossed, reserving judgment. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said firmly. "I'm here because accountability matters, because acknowledging our mistakes publicly is part of making amends." After the speech, as people mingled over coffee, a woman approached him. Her dark eyes held a mix of pain and hope as she introduced herself. "Mr. Hargrove, my brother was part of the group you defended in the Riverside trial." Mason felt his chest tighten with shame, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Your words tonight won't bring back the lives that were destroyed," she said quietly. "But hearing you acknowledge the role you played, it gives me hope that people can change." She touched his arm briefly. "Thank you for your honesty." Mason stood there, humbled by her words, feeling the weight of both shame and gratitude. The truth of his past actions sat heavy in his chest, but for the first time, he felt like he might be on the right path. Mason's hands trembled slightly as he opened Emily's letter at his kitchen table. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating her neat handwriting. Inside, he found a formal invitation to dinner at her home, along with a handwritten note that made his heart skip a beat. "Dad," it read, "this isn't forgiveness. It's a chance to show if your changes are real. James will be there. Don't make me regret this." He sat back in his chair, clutching the invitation. The prospect of meeting James, Emily's partner, filled him with nervous energy. After everything that had happened, after all his past prejudices, he knew this dinner would be a critical moment. Later that evening, Mason stood on Emily's front porch, holding a modest bouquet of yellow roses, Emily's favorites since childhood. The house was smaller than his, but well kept, with cheerful flower boxes in the windows. Before he could ring the doorbell, Emily opened the door. "Hi, Dad," she said, her tone careful but not cold. "Come in." James stood in the living room entryway, tall and composed in a crisp button-down shirt. His handshake was firm, professional. "Mr. Hargrove," he said with a slight nod. "Please, call me Mason," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thank you both for having me." The dining room was warm and inviting, with family photos lining the walls. Mason noticed several showing Emily and James at various events: hiking trips, family gatherings, graduations. He realized with a pang how much of her life he'd missed. Throughout dinner, Mason focused on listening rather than speaking. He watched how Emily's eyes lit up when James talked about their community outreach work, noticed their easy companionship. When James mentioned facing discrimination at his corporate job, Mason felt the old urge to dismiss or defend, but he caught himself. "That must be incredibly frustrating," he said instead, meeting James's surprised gaze. "I'm starting to understand how my actions as a lawyer contributed to those systemic problems." The conversation flowed more naturally after that moment of honesty. Emily shared stories about her work, and James discussed his passion for mentoring underprivileged youth. Mason found himself genuinely interested, asking questions rather than dominating the discussion as he once would have. As the evening drew to a close, Emily walked him to the door while James cleared the dishes. She paused in the foyer, studying his face. "You've still got a lot to prove, Dad," she said quietly. "But I see you're trying." Mason nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Through the dining room doorway, he could see James waiting for Emily, their comfortable intimacy evident even from a distance. He realized how close he'd come to losing this chance, to know his daughter, to be part of her life, to see her happy with someone who clearly adored her. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," he managed. "Both of you." Mason's shopping cart squeaked as he turned down the cereal aisle, his mind elsewhere. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he reached for a box of granola. That's when he heard it, a child's laugh, bright and clear. His hand froze mid-reach as he recognized Gerald Simmons standing 2 aisles over, helping his young son pick out fruit snacks. Mason's heart began to race. He hadn't seen Simmons since that confrontation in his driveway months ago. Part of him wanted to turn his cart around and flee, but something kept him rooted in place. When Simmons looked up and their eyes met, Mason felt a surge of anxiety mixed with determination. Taking a deep breath, Mason pushed his cart toward the produce section, where Simmons and his son were now examining apples. The boy, around 10 years old, was animatedly describing which ones looked best, while Simmons listened with patient attention. "Captain Simmons," Mason said softly, his voice slightly shaky. I hope I'm not interrupting." Simmons straightened up, his expression neutral but guarded. "Mr. Hargrove," he replied with a slight nod. "I wanted to thank you," Mason continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact, "for saving my life that day on the plane. I know I can never truly repay that debt." Simmons' son looked between them curiously, still clutching an apple in his small hands. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering something about wanting to check out the oranges. "As I wrote in my letter, Mr. Hargrove," Simmons responded evenly, "your journey toward redemption is your own responsibility. I simply did what any decent person would do." The boy tugged again at Simmons' sleeve more insistently. "Dad, can we get oranges too? Please?" Simmons' face softened as he looked down at his son. "Just a minute, buddy." He turned back to Mason. "If you'll excuse us." Mason nodded, stepping back to give them space. He watched as Simmons and his son made their way to the citrus display, the boy chattering excitedly while his father listened with genuine interest. The simple interaction between father and son struck Mason deeply. This was the kind of man Simmons was, despite everything he'd endured. In the parking lot, Mason loaded his groceries into his trunk while observing Simmons help his son into their car. The grace Simmons had shown in saving his life, despite their history, finally clicked into place. Mason closed his trunk, feeling an unexpected sense of peace. Some debts could never be repaid, but perhaps that wasn't the point. The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed softly as Mason organized a stack of legal documents. His silver-rimmed reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed each paper with careful attention. The shelter coordinator, Sarah Martinez, watched from her office doorway, noting how different he seemed from the angry man she'd first met months ago. "Mason," she called, stepping into the room, "I've got someone I'd like you to help." She held a manila folder, her expression serious. "It's a sensitive case." Mason nodded, clearing space on his desk. Over the past few months, he'd proven himself reliable, using his legal expertise to help victims navigate complicated paperwork and court procedures. The work felt meaningful in a way his previous career never had. In the small meeting room, Mason sat across from a young woman named Rachel Chen. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a paper cup of coffee. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "My father," she began, then paused to steady her voice. "He was walking home from work when they attacked him. The doctors say he might never walk properly again." Mason listened intently, his stomach nodding as she described the hate group responsible. He recognized their tactics, their patterns, the same ones he'd once dismissed as youthful mistakes while defending them in court. "The worst part," Rachel continued, "isn't just what they did to him. It's how they destroyed our sense of safety. Mom won't let my younger siblings play outside anymore. Dad jumps at sudden noises. We're all different now." Mason removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. The weight of his past choices pressed down on him. "Ms. Chen," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He took a deep breath. "Years ago, I defended the group that hurt your father. I helped them avoid serious consequences for similar attacks." Rachel's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Her eyes narrowed. "I was wrong," Mason continued. "Deeply, unforgivably wrong. I can't undo what I did, but I'm here now to help in whatever way I can." Silence filled the room. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice tight but controlled. "Owning it doesn't fix it, but it matters." Later that afternoon, Mason sat at his desk, surrounded by case files and legal forms. The fluorescent lights still buzzed, but he barely noticed. Rachel's words echoed in his mind as he reviewed another victim's statement, determined to help however he could. The courthouse loomed before Mason, its stone facade unchanged since the trial decades ago. He adjusted his tie nervously before pushing through the heavy wooden doors. The familiar smell of old paper and polished wood brought back memories he'd spent years trying to forget. At the archives desk, an elderly clerk looked up from her computer. Can I help you? Yes, Mason said, his voice slightly unsteady. I need to access transcripts from a civil rights trial from 1992. Case number 92CR158. He paused. I was the defense attorney. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. That'll take about 20 minutes to retrieve. Please fill out these forms. In the reading room, Mason sat at a wooden table beneath fluorescent lights. The stack of yellowed papers before him contained his own words from years ago. As he began reading, his stomach tightened. His younger self's voice rang clear in the transcripts. Clever, manipulative arguments that twisted facts to protect his clients. Your Honor, he had said, these men were merely exercising their right to free speech. The words made him wince now. He remembered the faces of the victims' families in the gallery, their pain evident as he dismissed their suffering with legal jargon and calculated rhetoric. One passage particularly struck him. A mother had testified about her son's fear after being threatened by the hate group. Mason had cross-examined her ruthlessly, suggesting she was exaggerating for sympathy. His questions had reduced her to tears, and he'd felt proud of himself then. The transcripts grew blurry as tears welled in his eyes. Each page revealed another example of how he'd used his skills to protect those who spread hatred and violence. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. Later, Mason sat on the courthouse steps, copies of the transcripts clutched in his trembling hands. Below, people hurried past, lawyers, clients, families, each caught up in their own legal battles. The afternoon sun felt too bright, too exposing. He stared at the papers in his lap, understanding with crushing clarity how many lives he'd helped destroy with his carefully crafted arguments. Taking a deep breath, Mason made a silent promise. He would spend whatever years he had left working to counter the damage he'd done, no matter how insignificant his efforts might seem in comparison to the harm he'd caused. Mason pulled up to Emily's modest suburban home, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the backyard, making his heart race. He grabbed the homemade potato salad from the passenger seat, a recipe he'd spent hours perfecting, and walked up the path to the front door. Emily opened the door before he could knock. "Hi, Dad," she said, her smile genuine but reserved. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it," Mason replied, holding up the bowl. I brought potato salad." "Come on through," Emily gestured. "Everyone's out back. James is manning the grill." Mason followed her through the house, taking in the family photos on the walls. He paused briefly at one showing Emily and James on their first date, their smiles radiant. The sight made his chest tighten with regret for all the moments he'd missed. The backyard was alive with activity. Children chased each other across the lawn, while adults clustered around tables laden with food. James stood at the grill, expertly flipping burgers and chatting with guests. "Mason," James nodded, extending his hand. "Glad you could make it. Emily mentioned you've been doing good work at the community center." "Yes, though there's still much to do," Mason replied, appreciating James's attempt at civility. "Those burgers smell amazing." As the evening progressed, Mason found himself drawn into conversations with Emily's friends. A young woman who worked with Emily at the hospital shared stories about their night shift adventures. An elderly neighbor praised Emily's kindness in helping with her groceries every week. Each story revealed another facet of his daughter's life he'd missed, but instead of his usual defensiveness, Mason felt grateful to be included now. He noticed James watching him throughout the evening, but the younger man's expression had softened from wariness to cautious acceptance. As dust settled over the yard, Emily approached Mason where he sat quietly observing the remaining guests. "You're different," she said, sitting beside him. "The old you would have tried to dominate every conversation, prove you were the smartest person here." Mason nodded, feeling the truth of her words. I'm learning to listen more than I speak. I'm proud of you, Dad, Emily said softly. You've come a long way. We still have work to do, but she placed her hand over his. This is a good start. Mason felt tears prick at his eyes, but blinked them back. This small gesture of acceptance meant more than any courtroom victory ever had. Mason sat at his mahogany desk, the evening sun casting long shadows across his study. Simmons' response letter lay before him, its creases worn from countless readings. The words still carried their weight. Redemption is a journey you must take on your own. Running his fingers over the paper, Mason pulled out a fresh sheet and uncapped his pen. This time, his hand moved with purpose rather than desperation. He wasn't seeking absolution. He'd learned that had to come from within. Instead, he began writing about gratitude. Dear Captain Simmons, he wrote, then paused, considering his words carefully. Your actions that day on the flight showed me what true strength looks like. Not just in saving my life during the medical emergency, but in how you handled my inexcusable behavior with dignity and grace. Mason's pen scratched across multiple pages as the night deepened. Crumpled drafts accumulated around his feet, each attempt getting closer to the truth he wanted to express. The desk lamp cast a warm glow as he worked through version after version, determined to get it right. Your example has inspired me to face my own prejudices, he wrote in his final draft. I've begun volunteering at a local shelter, using my legal expertise to help those I once ignored or actively worked against. While this doesn't erase the past, I hope it represents a step toward being part of the solution rather than the problem. He detailed how Simmons' response to hatred, choosing compassion over vengeance, had shaken him to his core. You had every right to let me suffer that day, given my role in defending those who hurt your family. Instead, you showed me what real character looks like. That lesson will stay with me for whatever time I have left. As dawn approached, Mason sealed the finished letter in an envelope. He didn't ask for a response or make any demands. This wasn't about him anymore. The morning air was crisp as Mason walked to his mailbox. Birds chirped in the oak trees lining his driveway, heralding the new day. He raised the red flag after placing the letter inside, watching as the early morning mail truck approached. As the postal worker collected his mail, Mason stood for a moment, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't need Simmons to acknowledge his gratitude. Writing it had been enough. With a deep breath of the morning air, he turned back toward his house, ready to continue the work of becoming someone his daughter could be proud of. The meeting room buzzed with quiet tension as Mason stood before the nonprofit's board members. Sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished conference table. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his courtroom dominance, now felt like armor worn for a different kind of battle, one that required humility instead of aggression. I'm here today because I want to make amends, Mason began, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. I've spent decades using my legal expertise to protect the wrong people, those who could afford to buy their way out of accountability. Now I want to use those same skills to help those I've hurt. He laid out his detailed proposal, a substantial donation from his retirement savings, coupled with a commitment to provide pro bono legal counsel to those who needed it most. The board members exchanged meaningful glances. Sarah Chen, the executive director, leaned forward in her chair, her expression carefully neutral. Mr. Hargrove, your reputation precedes you. Why should we trust this isn't just an attempt at image rehabilitation? We've seen plenty of those before. Mason nodded, having expected the question. You shouldn't trust me yet. I haven't earned that right. I'm asking for a chance to prove myself through actions, not words. That's all I can offer right now. Weeks later, Mason stood in a crowded community center, surrounded by the energetic buzz of a nonprofit fundraising event. The walls were decorated with colorful posters highlighting success stories and future initiatives. He'd spent the afternoon working with young lawyers, sharing strategies for defending victims of hate crimes. The irony wasn't lost on him, teaching others how to dismantle the very systems he'd once exploited for profit. "Your insight on the Thompson case was invaluable," remarked Jessica, a promising attorney he'd been mentoring. Her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as she spoke. "We wouldn't have spotted that precedent without your experience. It completely changed our approach." Mason watched the room fill with community members, some still casting wary glances his way. But increasingly, those looks were accompanied by tentative nods of acknowledgement and even small smiles. His consistent presence and genuine efforts were slowly shifting perceptions, one interaction at a time. Back home that night, Mason sat at his desk reviewing a stack of volunteer schedules under the warm glow of his desk lamp. His calendar was filled with commitments, legal clinics, mentoring sessions, board meetings. Each entry represented a small step toward redemption, a chance to use his privilege and expertise for good rather than gain. He picked up a photo of Emily and James from the recent barbecue, now framed on his desk. The joy in their faces, so natural and unguarded, reminded him why this work mattered. It wasn't about clearing his conscience. It was about creating lasting change in a community he'd once helped to harm. Their happiness was proof that change was possible. Mason added another pro bono case to his schedule, knowing the work ahead would be challenging but necessary. The path to redemption wasn't a destination, but a daily choice to do better, to be better. Each small decision was another brick in the foundation of his new life. The community center's fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Mason leaned over the scattered paperwork, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. Across the worn wooden table, Marcus Johnson, a young man in his mid-20s with tired eyes and tense shoulders, watched with wary attention as Mason explained the complex legal documents before them. "So this clause here," Mason pointed with his silver pen, tapping the page twice for emphasis, "protects your family's right to seek additional damages if more evidence comes to light. It's important we keep this option open." Marcus nodded slowly, fidgeting with the corner of a page, then paused. "Can I ask you something?" His voice carried a weight beyond his years, heavy with unspoken doubts. "Why do you care so much now? I mean, I've heard about your past cases. Everyone around here has." Mason set down his pen and met Marcus's gaze, forcing himself not to look away. From the justified suspicion he saw there, the question hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed the discomfort. "I spent decades being part of the problem," he admitted, his voice steady but humble, weathered by regret. "I can't change that past, but I can use whatever time I have left to try to make things right. Not for my conscience, but because it's what needs to be done." The young man studied him for a long moment, his expression gradually softening, before returning to the documents spread across the table. Later, walking home through the peaceful neighborhood streets lined with maple trees, Mason passed a newspaper stand that caught his eye. The front page featured a photo of Gerald Simmons receiving an Aviation Safety Award, standing proud in his crisp uniform. The headline praised his innovative approach to pilot training and commitment to excellence. Mason paused, a faint smile crossing his weathered face as he looked at the image of the man who had inadvertently changed the course of his life. The evening sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks as Mason settled into the old wooden chair on his porch, its familiar creaks a comfort now. The same chair where he'd once sat plotting revenge now served as a place of quiet reflection and peace. Oh, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sounds of children playing somewhere down the street, their laughter floating on the air. Mason knew there would always be those who questioned his motives, who couldn't see past his former self. He understood their skepticism. He'd earned it through years of defending the indefensible, through countless cases where he'd chosen profit over principle. But as he watched the sunset paint the clouds in deepening shades of gold, he felt a deep sense of peace. Not from achieving redemption, but from knowing he was finally doing the work that mattered, one case at a time. If you enjoyed the story of Mason, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.